Chapter 20, The Blackberry Kiss. That night I tried to write the mini journal for Mr. Berkway. I had a terrible time coming up with some things to write about. First, I made a list of all the things I liked, and they were all things from Bybanks. The trees, the cows, the chickens, the pigs, the fields, the swimming hole. It was a complete jumble of things, and then when I tried to write about any one of those things, I ended up writing about my mother, because everything was connected to her. At last, I wrote about the blackberry kiss. One morning on the farm, when I awoke and looked out the window, I saw my mother walking up the hill to the barn. Mist hung around the ground, finches were singing in the oak tree beside the house, and there was my mother, her pregnant belly sticking out in front of her. She was strolling up the hill, swinging her arms and saying, "Oh, don't fall in love with a sailor boy, a sailor boy. Oh, don't fall in love with a sailor boy, 'cause he'll take your heart to sea." As she approached the corner of the barn, where the sugar maple stands, she plucked a few blackberries from a stray bush and popped them into her mouth. She looked all around her, back at the house, across the fields, and up into the canopy of branches overhead. She took several quick steps up to the trunk of the maple, threw her arms around it, and kissed that tree soundly. Later that day I examined this tree trunk. I tried to wrap my arms around it, but the trunk was much bigger than it had seemed from my window. I looked up at where her mouth must have touched the trunk. I probably imagined this, but I thought I could detect a small dark stain, as from a blackberry kiss. I put my ear against the trunk and listened. I faced that tree squarely and kissed it firmly. To this day I can smell the smell of the bark, a sweet woody smell, and feel its ridges and taste that distinctive taste on my lips. In my mini journal I confess that I had since kissed all different kinds of trees, and each family of trees, oaks, maples, elms, birches, had a special flavor all of its own. Mixed in with each tree's own taste was a slight tang of blackberries, and why this was so I could not explain. The next day I turned in this story to Mr. Berkway. He didn't read it over or even look at it, but he said, "Marvelous, brilliant," as he slipped it into his briefcase. "I'll put it with the other journals." Phoebe said, "Did you write about me?" Ben said, "Did you write about me?" Mr. Berkway was bounding around the room as if the opportunity to teach us was his notion of paradise. He threw open the windows and sucked in the air. "Ah, September," he said. He pulled out a book and read a poem by E. Cummings. The poem was titled "The Little Horse is New." And the reason why the only capital letter in the title is the Y at the end of newly is because Mr. Cummings liked it to do it that way. He probably never looked English. He probably never took English, Phoebe said. To me that Y looked like the newly born horse standing up on his thin legs. The poem was about a newly born horse who doesn't know anything but feels everything. After that I could make a lot of sense out of anything except that this horse feels amazing and lives in a smooth, beautifully folded world. I liked that. I was not sure what it was, but I liked it. Everything sounded soft and safe. Thus far, it was not an unusual sort of day, purely normal as far as school goes. I started walking home alone because Phoebe had left early for a dentist's appointment. I was supposed to meet her at her house at 5 o'clock. I didn't even mind too much when Ben came running up behind me because I was in a good mood, and besides, I didn't really want to walk home by myself. I was completely unprepared for what happened on the way home, and of course for what happened later. Ben and I were simply walking along, and he said, "Did anyone ever read your poem?" "No." "I know how to do it," he said. "Want me to read yours?" We were passing a bus stop, and there was a wooden bench on the sidewalk. Ben said, "Come on, sit down." "I can't do it while we're walking along." He took my hand and stared at it for the longest time. His own hand was soft and warm. Mine was sweating like crazy. He was saying, and tracing the lines of my palm with his finger. It gave me the shivers, but not in an entirely unpleasant way. The sun was beating down on us, and I thought it might be nice to sit there forever with him just running his finger along my palm like that. I thought about the newly born horse who knows nothing and feels everything. I thought about the smooth, beautifully folded world. Finally, Ben said, "Do you want the good news first or the bad news?" "The bad news." "It isn't real bad, is it?" He coughed. "The bad news is that I really can't read palms." I snatched my hand away, grabbed my books, and started walking away. "Don't you want to know the good news?" he asked. I kept walking. "The good news is," he said, "that you let me hold your hand for almost 10 minutes, and you didn't flinch once." I didn't know quite what to make of him. He walked me all the way to my house, even though I refused to speak to him. He sat down on the porch. "I can't invite you in," I said. "That's okay," he said. "I'll wait." "For what?" "Aren't you going to Phoebe's at 5 o'clock?" "I'll wait." "You don't want to walk over there alone." "I'll sit here and do my homework." He pulled out his mythology book. I went inside and walked around. I looked out the window. He was still there. "Are you doing your mythology report?" I asked. "I guess I might as well sit out here and do mine too." He didn't say anything. In fact, neither of us said anything. He was reading his book and taking notes. I tried to read mine, but it was difficult to think with him sitting there. I was relieved when it was time to go to Phoebe's. When we passed Mrs. Cadaver's house, someone called my name. I didn't see anyone at first, but then I spotted Mrs. Partridge sitting in a lawn chair beside the house. "Hello," I said. "Who's that?" Ben asked. "Mrs. Partridge. She's blind." He gave me a queer look. "Then how did she know who you were?" It was a good question, but I did not know how to answer it. When I knocked at Phoebe's door, Ben said, "I'll be going now." I took a quick look at him and turned back to the door, but in that instant that I was turning my head, he leaned forward, and I do believe his lips kissed my ear. I was not sure this was what he intended. In fact, I was not sure it happened at all, because before I knew it, he had hopped down the steps and was walking away. The door inched open, and there was Phoebe's round face, as white and frightened as ever you could imagine. "Quick," she said, "come in." She led me into the kitchen. On the kitchen table was an apple pie, and beside it were 3 envelopes, one for Phoebe, one for Prudence, and one for their father. "I opened my note," Phoebe said, and showing it to me. It said, "Keep all the doors locked and call your father if you need anything. I love you, Phoebe." It was signed Mom. I didn't think too much of it. "Phoebe," I said. I know. It doesn't sound terrible or anything. In fact, my first thought was, well, good. She knows I'm old enough to be here by myself. I figured she was out shopping, or maybe she even decided to return to work, even though she wasn't supposed to go back to Rocky Rubbers until next week. But then Prudence came home and opened her note. Phoebe showed me the note left for Prudence. It said, "Please heat up the spaghetti sauce and boil the spaghetti. I love you, Prudence." It was signed Mom. I still didn't think too much of it. "She's probably just working late," I said. "I don't know," Phoebe said. "I don't like it. I don't like it one bit." Prudence heated up the spaghetti sauce and boiled the spaghetti while I helped Phoebe set the table. Phoebe and I even made a salad. "I do feel sort of independent," Phoebe said. Phoebe's father came home. "Where's Norma?" he said. Phoebe showed him his note. He opened it up and sat staring at the piece of paper. Phoebe looked over his shoulder and read his note aloud. "I had to go away. I can't explain. I'll call you in a few days." It was signed Norma. I had a sinking feeling. Prudence started asking a million questions. What did she mean? Go away where? Why can't she explain? Why didn't she tell you? Did she mention this? A few days? Where did she go? "Maybe we should call the police," Phoebe said. "The police? What for?" Mr. Winterbottom said. "I think she was kidnapped or something." "Oh, Phoebe." "I'm serious," she said. "Maybe a lunatic came in the house and dragged her off." "Phoebe, that is not funny." "I'm not being funny. I mean it. It could happen." Prudence was still asking questions. "Where did she go? Why didn't she mention this? Didn't she tell you? Where did she go?" "Prudence and I honestly cannot say," her father said. "I think we should call the police," Phoebe said. "Phoebe, if she was kidnapped, would the lunatic, as you say, allow her to sit down and write these notes? He might." "Phoebe, that's enough." He sat there staring at the note. Then he stood up, removed his coat, took off his tie, and said, "Let's eat." It was only then that he seemed to notice I was there. "Oh," he said. He looked quite embarrassed. "I'm sorry about all this, Sal." "I have to go," I said. At the door, Phoebe said, "My mother has disappeared. Sal, don't tell anyone. Don't tell a soul." At home, my father was slumped over the photo album. He used to close the album quickly when I came in the room, as if he were embarrassed to be caught with it. Lately, however, he didn't bother to close it. It was almost as if he didn't have the strength to do that. On the open page was a photo of my father and mother sitting in the grass beneath a sugar maple. His arms were around her and she was sort of folded into him. His face was pressed up next to hers, and their hair blended together. They looked like they were connected. "Phoebe's mother went away," I said. He looked up at me. "She left some notes. She says she's coming back, but I don't believe it." I went upstairs and tried to work on my mythology report. My father came to the door and said, "People usually come back." Now I can see that he was just talking in general, just trying to be comforting, but then that night I heard in what he said the tiniest reassurance of something I had been thinking and hoping. I had been praying that a miracle would happen and my mother would come back and we would return to Bybanks, and everything would be exactly as it used to be.